I was asked by a lady on YouTube to talk a little bit more about biblical femininity. She said she sincerely wanted to embrace biblical femininity, but needed some tips and direction on where to go. And this isn't going to be able to be done in just one video. I'm probably going to do it in 4. This one is embracing your highest calling. And then embracing your feminine role, which I think is where there's a lot of controversy. None of these are popular. Embracing your feminine appearance, and lastly, embracing your sexuality and your womb. So those are the 4 different topics that I'm going to cover. But this one, embracing your highest calling, is the foundation for this, because those other ones are going to be really, really tough if you do not grasp this. This is the concrete. This is where you're going to fall to when the rest of them get tough and they go against your own understanding. Also, this might not even be like Christian culture popular, because I don't think that your highest calling is what a lot of people say your highest calling is. I believe your highest calling as a woman is to be conformed to the image of Christ. And we are here for our Father's pleasure. So what I'm going to do is look at some key elements of Christ that I think are very, very much a part of my everyday life, and the strength that we need to accomplish our roles as Christian women, feminine Christian women, especially in a counterculture world. The first is that Jesus died to himself. He came to this earth, and God said that he learned to obey through the things that he suffered. And there's this scripture verse, I can't remember it. I was going to look up the reference and I forgot, but it says that Jesus was subject to God. And just as the wives are to be subject to their husbands. And that is an extremely important verse to note, because Jesus is equal with God the Father. And yet he was still in obedience under God the Father. And that is similar to a wife and a husband are equal as persons. God is no respecter of persons, but we are under their authority when we are married to them. And so we have to look to Christ to say, you know, what do you mean he learned obedience through the things that he suffered? And he is the example to all mankind to be obedient to God the Father, who said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Obedience is like the hot issue of our society. I saw somebody the other day say, you know, the reason why Satan, rebelled is because God's this demanding authority. Who wants to be under that hierarchy? And I just thought, what a culture when we're defending Satan and all authority is deemed as evil and oppressive. But we are called to be obedient to God the Father in whatever place we're planted. And that's what Jesus did. He was living for his Father's pleasure. And that often comes to death to self. Not my will, but thine be done. Our personal dreams, our demands, our wants, what we want from other people to give to us, none of those matter. What matters is, what does God the Father want from me? And you have to grasp that, to be conformed to Christ, to be a faithful steward in this life. The second thing that, you have death to self, but then also Jesus had a love for others. And as a woman, we are called to be servants. And we are called to, as Christians, we're called to be servants and being committed. It says Jesus' life was one of continual service. And he committed himself to their spiritual and often their physical needs. And our role as a Christian, and then as a female Christian, we all have roles of where we need to serve. And that is different depending on how old you are, what your surrounding circumstances look like, but it doesn't change that we're supposed to be a servant, and that is very difficult because we're brought up in a society of self-esteem, self-love. I'm going to look after myself and stand up for my rights. But that's not what Jesus did. He said, Lord, I'm here for your pleasure. And he often worked himself to the point where he didn't even have time to eat. He just really only set aside time to go and pray. Other than that, he was continually serving, continually preaching, continually giving in miracles. And that is our lot as Christians. Third, learn the ins and outs of biblical submission. This is also one of those controversial topics. I don't believe that submission and subjection are the same thing. I think that authority and submission are two separate issues. Authority is obedience and subjection. And every single human is subject under some authority. We have God, then we have church authority where we're subject one to another. We have governmental authority. All the powers that be are ordained of God, and we're not to rebel against them or rail against them. It says the power belongeth unto God. And then there's our parental authority. And then, your father, he has a boss, and the Bible calls them our masters. It's just verbiage, but we're under the authority of our bosses. Everybody has to be subject to someone and ultimately to the Lord. But submission, and even in marriage, is mutual. And how are we to be mutually submissive? And what is submissiveness? And I have an entire video on YouTube about submission. Submission is not subjection. But in a nutshell, it is esteeming others better than ourselves. And when I think about somebody who's obedient and in subjection, but who is not submissive, I think about Moses, his wife, and when they were told to circumcise their sons, and she was from a different culture and she wasn't going to do that. But then as they were stepping out the door of their house, there was an angel who said, I'm going to kill you. And she was like, fine, you and your nasty bloody religion. And she obeyed him, but she despised it in her heart. Subjection without submission. The same thing with husbands who will, you can't really truly love somebody as Christ loves the church without submitting yourself to them. And if you have an option and you can help them out and you can yield, why not? It's not necessarily giving up your authority on decisions, and when the rubber meets the road, you do what your husband says. But in the day in and day out, if you have a choice between Taco Bell and McDonald's and the one person likes Taco Bell, why not? Let's just do what you say. And then if you're kids, you can submit yourself one to another with your children. It's not surrendering your authority. It is an element of love, of esteeming them better than yourselves. And we as women need to learn that, because you can't truly be a servant if you're constantly annoyed at having to yield to the other person. You become a martyr, you become a victim. And that's just not the way. That's not what biblical femininity, that's not what a biblical Christianity is. All of these things are things that men and women both have to do. They both have to learn these, but then they're applied differently, and you'll see them in the next videos. But you need to understand what these are, because I'm going to keep referring back to them. The fourth is placing your security and safety in God. And I think that security is a huge need for women. We want to protect our children. We want to protect our loved ones. We want to protect our animals. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect our financial, nest egg. There's so many elements of security that we cling to as the weaker vessel. There, I said it. We're a weaker vessel. Not as people, but we are weaker. Look at women's sports. Genetic men, they dominate us every time. And in a world where might makes right, when God is not in the picture, women get dominated and are treated as servants over and over. And it's not until God's word gets in there where men are taught to treat women with respect and honor. That being said, placing your security in the Lord is extremely important. And I point to 1 Peter chapter 3, where it says the holy women of old who trusted in God. And I have a whole video on that on YouTube called The First Thing You Need to Know to Be a Good Wife, and what trusting God really looks like, especially when you're afraid that the people around you are going to make decisions that are going to impact you and impact your children and impact your safety. It's like when you are driving as a child, when you're riding in a car and your dad's been driving for forever. You don't even think twice. Like, am I going to get in an accident? Am I going to die? Am I going to be crippled? Because we've just trusted that our Father obviously knows how to drive. But then if you get in a car as a fully capable woman, and then you have a teenager in the car driving in the car next to you and you have no control, all you want to do is tell them how to do their job. This is how you do it. This is how and you are trying to control your own safety. And yet we have to remember that safety is of the Lord. So I would recommend that video on YouTube about the first thing you need to know to be a good wife, and understanding that your security and your safety is in God. Because that's integral to femininity and the roles that we play in society as God deems it. And the last one is self-control, time management, and priority management. You, unless you are working a full-time job as a single woman, if you are the keeper at home and the guide of your home, you are a CEO of a job place, of a workplace. I am a homeschool mom, 5 kids, manage my home, do this ministry. I consider this my day job. And I know that a mom's work never ends, neither does a dad. He comes home and he's a husband and a father. It doesn't ever end. But there is a level of a workload of what you have to get accomplished during certain hours. And Jesus was an excellent time manager, and he knew where he wanted to go, and he knew when he wanted to get there, and he knew how long it took to get there, and he managed his time well, and he had self-control. And when people were constantly oppressing him and asking him questions, and there were so many demands just flying at him, he didn't burst, because his strength, he was a conduit of God the Father. And he was serving God the Father, and he always set apart time to pray, which I talked about earlier. So those are the fundamental aspects of embracing your highest calling, of being conformed to the image of Christ. Of all of the attributes of Christ, I feel like those 5 should be a top priority for a woman who wants to embrace biblical femininity. And I will talk about those other 3 topics: embracing your feminine role, embracing your feminine appearance, and embracing your feminine sexuality and womb next week.